work within America itself, not to mention the fact that it doesn't get us off fossil fuels, but the shale industry in the US, has a problem because if oil prices come down, American shale companies start to lose money.
Well, I want to zoom out, and I was looking around to see if we used to have a globe in here, and I wanted to sort of address the globe because it literally affects every corner of the world, what's happened in the last few days, doesn't it? So let's look at Russia, because the plummeting oil prices that you were speaking about has an impact potentially on Russia's war in Ukraine, doesn't it? Because it's funding that from selling oil. So if oil prices are plummeting, it could undercut Russia's success in Ukraine, couldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is one argument that I think Oleg Deripaska, I saw, posted.
The Russian oligarch.
That's right, yeah, that US could now, and if you add up Canada, Guyana, Brazil, US has a greater share of the globe's oil supply with Venezuela. So yeah, could they influence prices and damage Russia? I don't know. Again, as we've talked about on this podcast, Venezuela's oil production is small at the moment, million barrels a day or something around that. So it would need, as we said, it takes years to kind of boost the industry. So it remains to be seen, what kind of control the US could have. But no doubt the US is a fossil fuel power, is becoming a greater fossil fuel oil power. But is that the right game to be in? That's my question. And China is the opposite side. It's a clean energy superpower. And you've got to look at what investors are thinking. And shares of clean energy companies have actually done well over Trump over the last 12 months.
Yeah, but is that about to change? If you've got this potential glut of oil and cheaper oil, is that going to, for example, here we hear a lot of pressure on the government in the UK about their net zero drive and their push for renewables. Are the opposition going to start saying we should take advantage of this glut of cheap oil?
Yes, I think outside China could well change, and we've seen backlash. We've seen a lot of questioning of net zero targets, unpopularity. So yes, I think it could. But China, is the big consumer of all resources and all commodities, and they have a firm strategy for electric vehicles, for moving off oil. They don't want to rely on oil imports, especially not in the current environment. So I think that is pretty certain, and that's going to be the direction China takes, which will impact all commodities.
Look, cheaper oil is good for consumers. It's good for consumers in the US, which Donald Trump is very keen on. It's very important for him and the whole affordability issue in the US. It's good for consumers in the UK. The question is, what does it mean in terms of the move to green energy? Does it disincentivize our move away from fossil fuels? But also the irony of the fact that it actually hurts US producers. And I think that is quite interesting. You were talking about Russia. Lower oil price hurts Iran. It hurts Russia. Taking away Venezuelan oil won't damage China, but 80% of Venezuelan oil now goes to China. So
although Trump has made noises about, they'll get all the oil they're currently buying from Venezuela. And we saw these, what they call dark tankers,
ghost tankers.
Tankers.
Exactly.
Yeah,
ghost tankers.
In dark mode, sailing out of
and I
Venezuela.
think that point is interesting, because the bigger issue here is Trump sort of dividing the world up into spheres of influence? Are we going to see a big grand bargain where it's like you get out of Latin America, but you can have the Pacific or Southeast Asia, Russia can, and that's the bigger question in my mind.
It's total imperialist vibes, isn't it?
Yes, it's a throwback to dividing up the world.
Because you heard Marco Rubio on the weekend saying again, we're not going to allow our adversaries to create a base in the Western Hemisphere. I mean, people like Chevron have said for years, this hasn't happened actually. China hasn't created a base in Venezuela. They haven't really capitalized on the fact that the US operators have disappeared. But obviously it helps the narrative. Maybe you don't need to have a complete invasion of American companies in order to control the tap. It makes Chinese teapot refineries have to pay more for oil. That helps US strategic intentions, and it puts pressure on other countries.
But it's a new colonialism, isn't it?
Yeah, but I think the biggest issue in my mind is these Latin American countries. The reason why China was so successful in Latin America is these countries are essentially neutral. A country like Chile, China's their biggest export market. They don't want to upset China. They're not picking sides, and this is the issue: is are these countries going to sign up to this new, Monroe Doctrine? Or are they willing to alienate and push back against China? I just don't think so, because China is the source of trade. But there's another
and buyer. Think
right.
of their agriculture at the moment. Think of soybeans. We've talked about on this show soybeans and American farmers. Brazil, Argentina, huge soybean kind of growers, and they all sell it to China. So China's position in Latin America, despite all of Trump's, cries to the contrary, is very powerful.
Well, we've talked about colonialism and imperialism. So let's look at where this goes next, because Trump has been clear today that Greenland is potentially in his sights. He said it before, but he said it with new clarity today. He's also talked about Cuba, even Mexico, which is bizarre because Mexico and the US are jointly hosting the World Cup. So how does that work? And how much of this is serious? What's your answer to how serious is he about Greenland, for example?
Well, I think we've been told to take him at his word, right? And we should actually believe what he says. And as we can see from the action that was initiated, I think, we should be concerned. And we saw Denmark, I think, put out a strong statement. So we should be concerned. I mean, I think
enough now, they said, didn't they? It was in sort of Trump-esque terms, which is obviously the way that world leaders think they have to talk to Trump these days. Yeah,
but I think Greenland, the resource angle is spurious, right? Yes, there are resources, but again, I don't like the reserves term that we've talked about. Yes, maybe resources, but at what price to get out? What kind of capex? Who's going to spend the money?
Really, is that tricky it's really tricky to get to the resource beneath Greenland?
Yeah, and the quality of the resource. There's lots of problems. Not that you would seize Greenland and tomorrow be a big producer of rare earths.
Shipping lanes as well with Greenland as well.
Yes, there's obviously strategic angles, but a big question is if he goes
to
for Greenland.
Your point about colonialism.
Yeah, what would Europe do? This could be a test of Europe's,
Well, Europe has been...
Europe's metal.
Right.
Europe's metal has been limp, to say the least, since the attack happened, hasn't it? So where in this spheres of influence, we've talked about China, we've talked about America, we've mentioned Russia. That's how it's sort of carved up, isn't it? Do you want to add anyone else into that?
I think Europe is in a tricky situation because it's a big market for China. Does it push back against China, risk upsetting China? It's now the US. We saw from the national security strategy, the US really down on Europe, saying Europe is facing huge cultural problems. So US is becoming antagonistic to Europe. So where does Europe go? I think the only answer is greater European unity, right, and greater resolve, within Europe.
Let's end with asking the question that I've been asking myself all weekend and asking every guest I get on the programme, what next? What is your prediction in terms of what Donald Trump does next in Venezuela, but beyond Venezuela too? And how does this just build a picture of this new era of resource nationalism, colonialism, new imperialism, whatever you want to call it, your terminology? What are we looking at next?
Yeah, so Venezuela seems incredibly uncertain from what I read. Again, I'm not obviously there, but what actually is the US going to do to run the place? He initially said we're going to run it, and then I think the State Department sort of cooled that down. What are they actually going to do? And the similar, you mentioned Iraq earlier, but they went into Iraq, but then there was no plan, right, for day two, or actually running the country, and it was chaos.
And we could still see boots on the ground in Venezuela. That has not been ruled out.
It hasn't ruled that out. So what are they actually going to do? Are they going to run the country? Because they've had this very successful mission. That's the kind of thing Trump likes. He said it was like watching TV.
But to your point that the concentration span isn't there for the long term. That's the problem. Short sugar hits.
And that's my answer to your question about the whole strategy is follow the money, right? Mm-hmm. Yes, you've got what he wants, Greenland and all these other places. Is the money from US companies actually going to follow and actually invest in these countries?
Rystad this weekend, who's an energy analyst, said that they think that it would cost $110 billion in order to get Venezuelan production to where it was just 10 years ago. That's a huge amount of money for
rebuilding
US
Gaza, rebuilding Ukraine. The US has got fingers in all these pies.
Exactly. For US companies to actually spend that money when the climate is uncertain, where the political landscape's uncertain, not just just in Venezuela, by the way, but in the US, because what happens when Trump in 3 years' time is no longer in office?
Yeah. And what would you call this new era we're in then? I offered you various terminologies. What would you go for?
I think it's a scramble for resources against the backdrop of a contested energy transition, which on the one hand, China is leading and the US is fighting against. But just to the earlier point, I think the difference, the US in many ways is trying to do a China, but the difference is the companies still operate as for-profit corporates. Chinese companies can be told to go in and make losses and invest.
And suck it up.
But US companies just can't do that. So how will the corporate side of America follow Trump's policies? As I say, follow the money. Are they actually going to back his broader strategy?
Helia, Henry, thank you both very much. That is it for this episode of The Forecast. Until next time, goodbye.